and over 600,000 of them pass through the ED into the hospital system. Now the problem with that is, let's say they have a fall, they're screening them for maybe they have a concussion, maybe they have a fracture. And then when they go into an institution, the risk of having a nosocomial infection, an institutional infection, goes up. Sepsis risks go up. And all of those things reduce the odds of you ever getting that resident back again. And it reduces the senior living census. And even if you're one of those communities that have a waiting list, and you're lucky enough to have that, think about the impact that getting that new resident acclimated takes on your staff. So, and not only that, the other impact that I think is huge is we all have a belief system, right? And elderly residents are resolute in their belief system, aren't they? I mean, you have no guesswork on what their political affiliation is or anything like that, do you? They have their beliefs. And any experience that affects their belief system affects how they live their life within the senior living community. And if they start falling, then they have lost the belief that they can be active. And the reason why that's important is the number one determining factor in how we age, the number one determining factor is our mobility. So the object of the game is to keep these residents active to reduce that risk of having a fall. Because once their belief system is compromised, they don't believe that they can be active. And part of that problem is the physicians, because a lot of times the physicians will share with the resident, well, you're just getting older, here's your cane, here's your walker. Their belief system is closed, and they stop looking for actions that will lead to a different reaction. So, you all shared with me some of the feelings that you have, and I think it's important to talk about the emotional component that accompanies the fall. Let me ask you a question. By show of hands, how many of you feel that these falls tend to come in waves in your community? Right? It's crazy, isn't it? The reason why I believe that happens is due to the behavioral effect that a fall has in a senior living community. So I was in the Tampa airport, and I was by the TSA security line. That's where all the people are. And there was an elderly gentleman who was on the floor in front of security, and he had fallen, and he had a scrape on his leg, and there was a mob of people standing around. I mean, like, Southwest Airlines could have done a commercial on it and said, "Want to get away?" You know, because that guy, bless his heart, I mean, you could see how embarrassed he was, and he felt ashamed. And all these people are looking at him, and he was stuck there. Fear and anxiety is important because, you know, human nature dictates we stay away from things that scare us. And if somebody's fallen, that's going to scare them, and that's going to cause movement avoidance behaviors that further cause them to spiral down. And then they're angry and frustrated with themselves. And loss of mobility is a loss. And seniors experience more loss than any other segment in the country. Loss of friends, loss of function, loss of esteem, loss of purpose. Take their mobility away, depression can accompany that. And depression is important because once somebody is depressed, their will to participate declines. And then they just start watching Wheel of Fortune and Jerry Springer, and they just hole up in the room and isolate themselves as a result of that. But it doesn't happen in a vacuum. If something happens to one resident, how aware are other residents of what happened? Right? It's like a cruise ship. They all talk, "Oh, did you hear about what happened to Sam? Yeah, he fell and he broke his hip." And what does the other residents say when they hear that? What would you guess? "I hope it doesn't happen to me." They say that, "I hope it doesn't happen to me." And they start thinking about all of those emotions that the resident who fell experienced. So now, cognitively or subconsciously, without even realizing it, they're projecting what event happened to that one resident onto themselves, and they start to have movement avoidance. that they get weak, and then they fall. What effect does that have on your staff? Right. If there was something, now is it just any one department in your staff, or is it anyone in your community? It could be anyone, right? And so they feel accountable, and I hear this over and over again. If there was only something that I could have done, which would have prevented it. And that's where I think we can lean into, because the medical model for all of the diagnoses is far different than what is applied to seniors with balance disorders. There's some challenges with it. So the American Geriatric Society has identified certain diagnoses that are correlated with fall risk. Cardiovascular, so heart disease, any heart disease that is there can be correlated with fall risk. Cognitive impairments, dementia patients, the memory care units that we work with have a much more difficult problem dealing with dementia residents. There's much higher fall rates of dementia. Endocrine. The reason why endocrine is there is diabetic patients. And we're going to talk more about diabetic patients related to this, but if they have diabetes and they have peripheral neuropathy, if that has affected their protective sensation in the bottom of their feet, they're 15 times more likely to fall. 15 times. And then if they get deconditioned, we're going to get into that. Dizziness. Dizziness could be medication related, or it could be involved with different balance systems that we're going to talk about here in a minute. Obviously, if they have a stroke, MS, Parkinson's, then that's going to increase their fall risk. Orthopedic, we tend to think about, like osteoarthritis. And that certainly is important, but so is osteoporosis. You don't see a lot of really muscular osteoporotic patients by and large, do you? I mean, they tend to be, not have quite the muscle mass. And so if they have osteoporosis, then if they fall, then it's highly catastrophic. And then visual deficits. Visual deficits could be even glasses. So if I take my glasses off, you all are blurry, which would probably help my nerves as a public speaker. but having prescription eyewear is a visual deficit. And so that can be contributed to falls. So when I started looking at other diagnoses that we were seeing, we worked at this point in our database with over 1 million patients on this. But there's a couple of other diagnoses in my research with senior living communities that popped up. And I think it's important to know these diagnoses, because if we know what the diagnoses are that are correlated with fall risk, then it helps increase our awareness so we can be more predictive in our intervention. Does that make sense? So incontinence was one that popped up. In one community in Alabama, I met with their clinical team. We went through all of their residents, all of their diagnoses, and it was huge. It was like 150 residents in there. All of their diagnoses, and we looked at what the comorbidities were that were associated with their patients that had issues with their balance. The number one diagnosis that came to the surface was incontinence. And that makes sense to me. I mean, there's a couple of different reasons that could be associated with incontinence. But if they have pelvic floor weakness, then what I found was in those same residents, they also had hip weakness as well. So that was one that came out to me. There was another senior living community that mentioned to me, I don't know if balance is the big issue, but getting them to drink more water is the problem. And I said, okay, so tell me about that. They said, well, they take medicine, it makes them pee, and they feel like there's a safety risk to get to and from the bathroom. So they don't drink as much water, and then their urine smells and gets concentrated, and I mean, we all know what dehydration can do to us, right? So, the issue was really, it got down to, they didn't feel safe getting to and from the bathrooms, they weren't hydrated. So the approach that we took with it was we got all the residents' water bottles so we could measure their fluid intake. We addressed the balance issues to improve their adherence to their continence care. But any of these are associated with fall risk. So the question, yes, sir.
Depression associated with fall risk? You have depression.
Well, depression is certainly a risk factor. We're going to get into that. These are just ones that the American Geriatric Society associated with fall risk. That's a great question. So the question was, depression isn't up there. And depression certainly is. And we're going to touch on it. That's a great point for that. But the question that we can ask, if these are associated with fall risk, what would happen if we reverse the polarity on these diagnoses and actually improve their balance? What effect would improved balance have on those diagnoses? And what we have seen, and the research is bearing this out, is, I have to suck in the gut because the camera guy just came in. So what would the effect be if we were to reverse the polarity and study what happens to improve their balance in these different diagnoses? And what we found is for cardiac and pulmonary diagnoses, that if you improve their balance with standardized testing and it's all measured out, then within a month, the endurance on the Borg scale improved by 20%. And their 2-minute walk test improved even more than that. So we know that if we improve their balance, we actually improve the endurance for these different diagnoses as well. And we are able to draw a correlation with decreased hospitalizations on that. Endocrine system, insulin sensitivity improves with movement. I had one patient who her rate of insulin usage actually decreased by 50% within 6 weeks. That's wonderful news for these folks. And what I love about it is it gives them hope where they feel like they don't have it. Any other questions on this slide? Yes, ma'am.
Emotion, the one before that, I didn't know we were really asking. One of the things that gets me nervous about residents that fall is the first thing they do with people with dementia. You guarantee they'll be dying, they'll die in 3 months, and they're not going to be the same. So I get nervous because one of my patients falls, and I have one that was one of my favorites, and she had Alzheimer's. And within that 3 months, she did die. And it just made me sad. So now I'm in here, don't get in my dementia patient from all that, don't fall.
Right.
It's like they predict they're gonna die in 3 months.
So one of the predictors, I'm sorry, tell me your name again. Sheila. One of the predictors that Sheila had heard was, if a dementia resident falls, that within 3 months they're going to be dead. And dementia is really tricky because there's different types of dementia that occur. So if you've got, a patient, this stage of the dementia also plays an influence. So if it's early onset, and if it's early onset dementia, then I wouldn't draw a correlation there. If it's advanced dementia, then their life expectancy is going to compress. I mean, advanced dementia has things going on like their visual field changes. And as we're going to talk about, there's different systems of balance. And none of these patients just have one thing going on. The residents have one thing going on, do they? So their medical comorbidities also play a role in what their risk-adjusted factors would be. Great question. So polypharmacy is another one. There's 1,000 medications that are associated with fall risk. So what we found that we needed to do was actually build into our platform a med reconciliation component that can account for medications that have different risk factors associated with it. So antidepressants. Depression is the key to this. And so if they're on antidepressants, they have a 66% more chance of having a fall. But it may not be related specific to the medication. It may be more associated with depression. And the reason for that is because the activity level of patients with depression doesn't seem to be as high. So if they do have depression, it's a risk factor. We've got to keep them moving. And there's certain research now that indicates the position of our bodies actually affect our emotions. So people in this position have higher rates of depression. How many of your residents are in this position? An interesting thing to study would be how many of those residents in this position are on antidepressants. I've never studied it, but I reckon if I were to, I would see a pretty strong correlation. To the point where they've actually been able to measure people on cell phones that are looking down, they have higher rates of depression because of this position. It all has to deal with how our parasympathetic system, how our nerves from our body goes to our brain. Sorry about that. The benzos have a 48% increase in fall risk. So this is the Xanax medication. And it's notable because a lot of elderly patients are on Xanax for their anxiety. So any change in their prescription, it could be an existing prescription that hasn't changed or a new prescription. We know for 2 weeks their fall risk is going to be so much higher. So anytime they go to the physician, part of that predictive model is really diving into, when they went to that physician practice, what changes in their medication. And then the caregivers within that senior living community can take a high-touch approach to monitor any changes in their endurance, gait patterns, or anything like that. Okay, so additional risk factors. The more diagnoses that they have, the greater their fall risk is. And when we think about the American Geriatric Society of the list, how many of you have residents that have 4 of those diagnoses? Right? How many have residents that have 3 of those diagnoses? I mean, they're multi-morbid usually. So the other thing that has come up is the lower extremity strength deficits. And you can be specific with this one. When you go to a resident, have them scoot their feet up by their hips and ask them to raise their hips up off the bed. What you'll find is that's a very challenging activity. They can barely get their hips up. And the reason why that's relevant is there's a saying that we have in physical therapy. Proximal stability leads to distal mobility. Proximal stability leads to distal mobility. So if their hip extensors are weak, then that's going to affect their gait pattern. And there's a cascade effect that's associated with that. And a certain mobility dysfunction that occurs when there's a problem with one of their balance systems. So, mobility dysfunction, if they're on a walker or a cane, they're requiring an external device to prevent them from having a fall. That is a mobility dysfunction. There's certain walking patterns that we'll talk about that also are a mobility dysfunction that have a terrible cascade effect on the residents. And then there's balance disorders, that are just a basket of issues that they might be having. So we have more than one balance system. So these multiple systems are involved in helping our bodies maintain balance. And they're all calibrated to a certain activity level. So if you solely focus on strength in a rehab approach to that, it's going to have a limited clinical outcome related to that. But wait, it gets worse. So the other issue that tends to happen is the elderly residents minimize what their problems are to their physician. And I'll just talk to Glenda. Glenda had one of her falls. And she went to the physician, and I wasn't with her on this physician appointment. But she goes in, I'm getting around pretty good. And she had a fall the week before. Less than half of your residents that go to the physician even communicate that they've had an issue with it, right? And I see some of our physician partners, and I think you guys could agree with that. I mean, it's just, they minimize it, related to that. So now the physician isn't even able to make a sufficient clinical decision on the intervention that they actually need because they're not getting the right information. Okay, so there's not just one system of balance. I mean, back in the good old days before I had gray hair, in PT school, we focused really on the musculoskeletal system. And it is important, but it's mostly important from the perspective of standing balance, just standing balance. So strengthening is really important. Most of our balance is governed by the musculoskeletal system. We talked about the diabetic patients. So this protective sensation, there's a Sense-Weinstein monofilament test that can be done on your diabetic patients. And it determines whether or not they've lost protective sensation. And so if they've lost protective sensation, some of the complaints that they'll have are they feel like their feet are burning, so now they're on a neural suppressant, which causes other balance issues going on, right? And what we know is if we're able to increase the stride length on a resident, we're actually able to reduce the complaints of their neuropathic pains, in some cases by as much as 50%. The reason why I believe that happens is once their balance improves, they're taking a longer stride length. As they take a longer stride length, the blood supply to the foot improves. We've seen it over and over again. And in fact, you can actually, once you improve a resident's stride length, you actually improve the protective sensation in their feet by about 20%. Those are very good static balance systems. The parts that tend to get missed are the vestibular and the oculomotor systems. So there's a couple of things that happen within your vestibular system. Your inner ear. Your inner ear has two functions, hearing and balance. So what you have in this section of the inner ear, you have little calcium carbonate crystals, 10 microns big. It's like silt. And sometimes that gets into these semicircular canals, almost always this one right here. And it interrupts the fluid flow, which interrupts the calibration of that inner ear, and that causes dizziness. It's called benign paroxysmal positional vertigo. So when somebody lays down, they have like, ooh, that dizziness. Has anyone ever laid down and felt dizzy for a few seconds and then it goes away? That's positional vertigo, right? It's very common in the elderly. Now, the bigger issue, if I get you all to stand up, if you have to follow risk, don't do this. But everybody else, go ahead and stand up. I want you to put your feet together, and I want you to cross your arms, all right? Now, before you do this, I want you to look at me. Now, I have no balance issues. I can run a 5K, it ain't pretty, but I can do it. I've got no balance issues, right? But I'm going to close my eyes, and I want you to watch what happens. What do you notice?
You sway.
A little bit of sway. Okay, now close your eyes. I've got good company. That's so what happens is the reason why we feel that sway is we challenged one of our vestibular reflexes. And the problem is with the elderly, if they're not moving a lot, that gets understimulated, and it's called vestibular hypofunction. And there's a very tangible impact that this has to your residents' walking pattern. And it looks like this. Does that look familiar?
Mm-hmm.
Now we tell them to do what? What do we tell them to do? Stand up a little bit, and what do they say back? I gotta see where I'm going, right? It's crazy. but they're looking at the floor, and that's the impact of that vestibular hypofunction, is they then become visually dependent on their balance, and they look at the floor. And that is central to a good predictive model in a senior living community, because that's the problem. And if we can apply actions that will resolve the problem, then we reduce the fall risk. Does that make sense? So, but the cascade effects of this walking pattern, if they're walking like this, now picture walking, like if you had to walk, but you were bent over in this position, it's going to shorten the step length that you're able to take, right? So you're not able to take as long of a step anymore. And so the change in the muscles that get used to walk also change. So instead of using my big primary movers in my legs, now I'm just using my hip flexors to just kind of step forward, right? So my legs get weak. The other component to this is, because I'm not using the big muscles in my legs, now my heart isn't getting as much exercise. So my heart gets weak, and the volume of blood that I push out is less, right? They look at this stuff. The other problem is, in this position, now I'm compressing the lower part of my lungs, the really well vascularized part of my lungs. And so I'm using upper third of my lungs to really try to do some breathing related to this, right? So that affects my endurance, it affects my cognitive ability. And like we talked about, there's evidence that's coming out that in this position, now there's higher rates of depression, so now they don't even want to do anything. So just that one walking pattern has an entire cascade effect through a resident's mind, body, and soul. Yes, ma'am. So the question was, have you ever seen anybody recover from it? And that's the story of hope. The vestibular system is easily stimulated. And so I'll give you an example. I went into one senior living community, knocked on the door, and the door that opened up looked like Linda's, and bruised face. Her activity level used to be to walk around the community for exercise. And because of her fall, she was no longer able to do that. By the time she was discharged, she was able to walk with her eyes closed, turning her head side to side and up and down, forwards and backwards. So it's easily stimulated. But that's where we have to confront everybody's belief system as far as what's possible with seniors. Look, we have seniors, 80-year-old seniors, running marathons. I have no excuse. I mean, the Rock and Roll Marathon in San Diego, 84 years old, had a history of cancer, had cellulitis, open wound, did a marathon. Our bodies, if we apply an action to our bodies always have a response to it. Always. Great question. So the vestibular system also gets involved with the visual system. It helps with how our eyes stabilize on an object. So if our vestibular system is underperforming, has anyone ever seen a video with like a small kid that does a video and it's all over the place? Well, that's kind of what they're experiencing. It's called cerebral oscillopsia. But these two components here account for 2/3 of our dynamic balance, approximately 2/3. So it's important that all of these systems are measured and evaluated to provide a better clinical outcome, not just the one. So here's another important thing as the fall risk continues. Any change in that resident's status is going to increase their fall risk. So changes in their, for example, when they go from a home to an ALF, how many of your residents come to a new resident have a history of falls or balance issues? Do you have any that don't? They all have it, right? And so anyway, that is a flag right there that early intervention is going to lead to a different outcome. And when we look at all of those diagnoses, like if we're if we're diagnosed with heart disease, the doctors manage that as quickly as possible, don't they? When do elderly with balance issues usually get a rehab report? After they've had a fall. One is proactive and predictive, and the other is reactive. And that's the paradigm shift that we're able to draw with that. So, if they go to a relative's home, or another change of environment, let's say they're going out to eat, and their curve is just a little bit higher than what they're used to. You know, I mean, I've seen elderly fall just going out to eat, and they have their walker, they're doing everything right, but the curve is a little bit higher, and they caught that curve is down the line. So any change in the environment increases their risk factor. And any change in medical status. We talked about the medications. You know, if they have new diagnoses, you know, then they're going to have an increase in their fall risk. But the flu, the cold, that's a new diagnosis, isn't it? And the problem with that is, once they go and they're in bed for a day or two, it only takes 24 hours for those balance systems to start to decompensate. So their fall risk goes up as a result of that. Heart failure. On average, heart failure residents are going to exacerbate 3 times a year, give or take. So, you know, any exacerbation of that diagnosis is going to have an impact. So, anything that's going to reduce their activity is going to increase their fall risk. It's very correlated. The opportunity that we have is once we discharge a resident from therapy, that we get them scheduled in 6 months to have them reevaluated to see what is their decline. Because what we have found in our sample size, and it's big, is we take a resident from a high fall risk to a low fall risk. In about 6 to 8 months, they migrate back up into a high fall risk. They might not have had a fall, but their fall risk increases nonetheless. So that early intervention takes more of a proactive stance with that. So what I did was I started looking at, okay, so how do senior living communities function against the medical model? The medical model is a model of health which suggests that disease is detected and identified through a systemic process of observation, description, and differentiation in accordance with standard accepted procedures, such as medical examinations, tests, or a set of symptoms. Once that diagnosis is identified, then it's managed. Once your resident has an issue with their mobility or their balance, which we know that they do, then it needs to be managed. And some of the research that has come out over the past few years really looks at the elderly that they don't have a fall risk or they don't have a fall risk. It's more like a dimmer switch. They're somewhere on that spectrum. It's the acuity of where they're at on that spectrum that matters. So here's some successful medical model elements. Early intervention. You've got a multidisciplinary team. Multidisciplinary teams, by far, reduce the rate of hospitalizations. Multiple care settings, testing clinical outcomes. If you don't know what tests that your folks are doing in your senior living community, then you don't know if all 4 systems of balance that are calibrated to reduce the fall risk are being looked at, right? So if it's strength and transfers and the distance that they walk, you know, that's good, that's a good functional assessment, but it's not going to tell you the root cause of why that resident fell in the first place. And wouldn't that be nice? So, you know, ask, what tests and measurements are you doing on these 4 systems of balance? The multiple care settings. I want to pause on this for a second because if you're looking at your rate of incident reports and it's not where you would like it to be, or if you've lost some residents and it's not where you'd like it to be, then in the hospital setting, and I'll just step back from it, in the hospital setting, when you look at their rehab departments, they have a whole team of therapists, right? Some are orthopedic therapists, some are neurological therapists, some are geriatric therapists, some are balance therapists. There's a lot of variability in the skill level. And in my industry, there's a lot of variability. Yes, sir.
Two quick questions in terms of based on your experience and what contributes to the fall. When the docs start up new blood pressure medications, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that. And then the second is a lot of times with hospice patients or people who are perceived to be in pain, doctor comes in and adds a pain medication. What is the impact from your experience on balance and subsequently falls?
So let me start with the first one, which was the blood pressure medication. So when a resident is put on the new blood pressure medication, there's 3 positions you would want to evaluate that they're in: supine, laying down, face up, sitting, and standing, and to look for blood pressure drops between those 3. Because if there is, and it takes a few days, for that medication to really get into their system, So you've got to keep an eye on the blood pressure in those 3 positions, and that can help guide you on that. If they have complaints of looseness after they've walked about 20 feet, that's a very common culprit related to that. So the second one was related to hospice and pain medication. So in home health, we don't have the opportunity to work a lot with hospice patients because it's restorative. Where therapy is allowed to work with them, gets into more of the pain management component related to that. But even that's limited for that. But pain medication certainly is one of those 1,000 medications that are correlated with fall risk. But it's a balancing act. I mean, it's difficult to ask someone to be in pain, yeah.
So just as a follow-up, as you may know, in Florida, we have a liability insurance crisis, substantially being driven by a rise in lawsuits due to severity and frequency of, among others, elopements and falls. And so structurally trying to address or detect falls and reducing falls in significant numbers would obviously have a dramatic impact on reducing risk associated with the liability insurance market. So are there, I guess, in your judgment, are there systems or early predictive systems that can help the supervising staff at the facility do a better job at being able to identify that? Obviously, the medications clearly are a signal that should put people on alert, but are there other systems that get us there more rapidly?
So all of these risk factors that we're looking at are predictive to that end. The staff education component really gets into teaching them safe transfers. And another component is the increase in verbal cues. This is where everybody has to speak the same language. So night shift, day shift. There was one skilled nursing community that they were having issues with new movements into the SNF. They had, I think it was 19 hospitalizations because they forgot to use their walker and they were having a fall. So it was putting a lot of pressure on them. So especially if they have mild cognitive decline, which a lot of those patients do have, if there's an increase in verbal cues by a factor of a lot, then you can reduce that fall risk to help them use their assistive device or to ask for assistance. So every time that resident started to get up, what we did was we taught the staff to jump in there and proactively, okay, so what are the steps that you're supposed to take in order to move safely? What are the steps that you're supposed to take in order to move safely? And what we found is all the staff leaned into it because none of us like to see that horrifying, tragic accident. And they went down from 19 events over the course of a month down to 2. by really doing that reinforcement. And I mean, they did it all day long, all evening long. And what that did was it helped get that resident tuned in to asking for help. So that's probably the best advice I could give you related to that. Rick, is there anything, or Josh, you guys, is there anything you want to add to that? What you guys see regarding hospice patients?
A question and a comment.
Yes.
Several communities have like as part of their assessment and evaluation for new movement, almost everybody does an assessment, right? Not several. But several communities have like a specific one for fall risk evaluation. Just probably a questionnaire, they go through that. Adding to that, do you think there's value in doing a more in-depth predictive assessment using experts such as you or someone else coming in, and generally as part of the assessment, and that can be sort of analyzed. But I think the key question there is what would be the financial model for, I don't know if you're going to touch on the financial aspect of it, but
Yeah.
if a community were to choose to do that, you can touch upon where the cost.
So it's a great question. So within our industry, there is no cost, to the patient. And so any new move-in that has a history of falls, an assisted device, that predictive walking pattern, I cannot underscore how important that walking pattern is. That is lightning in a bottle. That one, if communities adopt that, I'm telling you, you can reduce the rate of injury. So then, having a company come in and evaluate these 4 systems of balance, we run a battery of about 14 different tests and measurements on those 4 systems of balance, so we can really understand what the root cause of that problem is. So that, and then the other component, really, but frankly, we brought up the risk assessment, is I see a lot of variability in the times that those risk assessments are done. It can be in move-in. Some communities do them every 6 months, some do them every 3 months, some do them once a month. I mean, I'm a proponent of a high-touch approach, because the closer you are to that resident, the more you're able to get early intervention. Yes, ma'am.
Just a comment, looking at the fall risk, and I don't know about other facilities here, but I think one of the other fall risks for seniors in assisted living, you talked about the posture, how to get to that point, and the assisted device is not, I don't want to say not other family members are not educated enough, because sometimes you will find suddenly in your assisted living, you'll have a Joe who's maybe 6'2", and his daughter decides that he needs a walker, so she brings from home her sister's walker, who happen to be 5'5",
Right.
and suddenly you see Joe, and not going to therapy and getting adjusted to his height.
Yeah.
So suddenly now, we see that and trying to, and I know they're trying to save money, but that's a big issue, just educating families on making sure if you're gonna get the device, make sure it's adjusted to their height.
But that's the shift. That's the shift, because all the team is involved now in the senior living community. So that proactive stance can actually reduce that. And the other thing that I want to share with you real quickly is if you stimulate that vestibular system related to their visual system, they go from walking like this, now they're able to stand upright because they're able to stabilize their vision on things that are farther away. That is really key related to that. So, the other thing that I want to take, I see, in our work together, that there can be a turf war between Part B providers and home health. And there should not be, because actually with a predictive model, you actually increase the Part B business that goes through there. And if patients or residents rather will benefit from a battery of tests over 4 systems of balance, Not all organizations do that, so, you know, if the parking provider isn't equipped for that, then there's an opportunity for the home care company to provide the specific balance intervention, turn that over upon discharge to the parking provider, so you're in essence doubling the level of care that the resident has available to them. But look for incongruencies in the medical model in your senior living community guides our actions, which lead to a different result. So these are some that we could take note of. I mean, we talked about a lot of these. The predictive walking pattern for me is so central to this because of the cascade effect. So developing a predictive model, like we talked about, it begins upon admission. If they have a history or fear of falling, plug them into therapy right out of the gate. Tracking of the effect of a FALA risk plan. If we don't know the past history, it tells us what our future results are going to be. So I like to take a look at the past 6 months of incident reports that are related to a fall, implement a predictive model within senior living communities, and then track what effect that has on the overall incident reports or hospitalizations. Education for the community on predictive fall risk walking patterns and risk factors. If the staff are aware of what it is to look for, now they're empowered to do something about it. And then staff education, all associates play a role. So I call this the sphere of influence of associates on balance programs or on followers. Activity coordinators, they can be educated on red flags to look for, routine participants that are now declining activities, decreased endurance with activity, complaints about feeling run down, all of those things, if they're educated to look for that, then a communication can be established with the wellness director, or director of nursing, right? And that communication flow goes 2 ways. So weekly, the wellness director will approach their activity coordinator and say, hey, so what decline in activity did you see? Tell me about the residents. Now we're increasing the communication, and all associates are pulling that rope in the same direction for that. Resident care coordinators, the red flags, shortness of breath, depression, complaints of flu-like symptoms, general malaise, any of that stuff. And apply that same communication flow to the wellness director. In fact, anytime I have the honor of presenting to a senior living community, I ask, can we have everybody come in, for just 30 minutes to talk through this? Even if I have to do one in the day and one at night, at least everybody's aware of what to do and how to address this. Food service, they are so central because they pick up on things too. Decreased appetite is a big one. I'm just not feeling so great today. Well, if we know that, then we can get our arms around them and really support these folks differently. A decreased swallowing can also be a flag that something is going on. So, when we look at residents that have a predictive approach put into this, here's the results that we were able to find with this. 85% of these patients, SIMSTRATS patients, had improved gait speed. If you improve their gait speed 0.33 feet per second, you reduce the risk of hospitalization and death. And even over the age of 85, we were able to demonstrate a 0.5 increase in their gait speed. 93% showed improved functional mobility, 95% improved self-care activities, and you can see which ones that those were, and 95% demonstrated improvement in their static and dynamic balance. Those are great numbers. All right. So if we do this, here's the one they have. Isn't that beautiful? Think about what she looked like before. Well, here she is now. And so that's my son. So she is now able to be back out in the community. And this is a deep journey for me. I'm not going to pitch it. I'm actually doing research and measuring this out there. I've got, if you guys want to talk to me more, I've got a booth across the hallway. I'd love to answer any other questions you may have. Thank you so much.